Thanks, Alan, very, very much. You're too kind, and I've been looking forward to being here because when Ratna phoned me, she was and dumped this question: what are 5 good ideas that you have about social innovation? It spurred in me an excitement that I haven't had for quite a while, and so for the last 5 or 6 months, I've been laying awake at night and asking myself, where have I gone wrong? And there's a little voice in me that says, this is going to take more than a night. So what I'm going to share with you tonight are some reflections about what I think about at night when I think about social innovation. I hope some of them will be practical. I forgot about the practical bent, whoever asked me, but perhaps we can extract some practicality out of this as we talk about it later on. First thing I'd like to say is that for me, the most important thing about social innovation is that it starts with a group of people I call passionate amateurs. The disruptive innovations that I know, the ones that tip the scales of social and economic justice, come from the edges. They come from the periphery of formal systems and institutions. Most of the innovations that I know started with people who are experiencing the issue, so-called users, people who live with challenges most of the day, sometimes 24 hours a day all the time, or share their lives with people who do. So there is, by definition, an imperative to innovate. They're fueled by love, by duty, by commitment, and the need to invent themselves out of messes, out of challenges, out of frustrations, out of barriers. This, in my view, is the heartland of social innovation. Now, what these passionate amateurs do when they invent usually migrates to the nonprofit sector. Occasionally they migrate into statute and laws, into funding, and into programs, and we often forget their origins. 80%, as Sherry Torjman has written so well about, 80% of the care in Canada is provided by families, friends, neighbors, co-workers, and networks, yet it receives only 20% of the financial resources. Or to put it another way, 80% of the resources in Canada that are devoted to care are devoted to paid professional care, and then only 20% is available to support the passionate amateurs who are constantly inventing solutions to the challenge of home care in Canada. Do they know the issues, these passionate amateurs? Yes. Do they have the solutions? Yes. Is anyone paying attention? Not many. In our research, in our design, in our policy, we tend to privilege theoretical or professional knowledge over experiential knowledge. Simone Weil, the great French mystic, said, intelligence is enlightened by love. We have, in my view, asymmetrical social innovation in Canada. It's no longer clear to me that nonprofits, policymakers, government speak for people experiencing, authentically speak for people who are experiencing poverty, homelessness, who are dealing with the challenges of immigration, who are dealing with the challenges related to securing a job, managing a family, et cetera, in this society. And at the very least, it seems to me that we should be building into the DNA of any strategy around social innovation the involvement of passionate amateurs along with the nonprofit sector, the government sector, and the business sector. In my view, it's been overlooked, and it would be worth devoting serious thinking to designing resources to ensure that there is symmetry between passionate amateurs and those other 3 sectors. Second thing I want to say about social innovation is that it's a marriage of the past and the future. So, what was the best thing before sliced bread? In other words, social innovation is a new label for old pursuits. The Women's Institute, which began here in Ontario in Stony Creek in the 1890s, is still alive and well around the globe. Today, over 8 million women are involved in over 60 countries. This is a Canadian invention, started here well over 100 years ago, that is still thriving and making a difference in the lives of women globally. Think of AA. Think of the Red Cross. Think of the Leshe League. Think of the Blue Box, which was invented by, among many people, Jack McGuinness here in Ontario. These have had undeniable impact way before people thought about a concept like social innovation. And despite their successes, and this is the key point as well, that despite their successes of AA or Red Cross, La Leshe, et cetera, their missions are not yet complete. This is what I mean by a marriage of the past and the future. The change is, unfortunately for you younger people here, is generational. And our obsession with one law, one program, one fund can betray how long it really takes to implement, to change regs, to change relationships, to change habits, to change culture, to change attitudes. The RDSP that Alan referred to earlier, the Registered Disability Savings Plan, took us at least 8 years of hard work, of hard lobbying, to get it into play, to begin to address the fact that people with disabilities are poor, and if we address that, we can take care of a lot of the other challenges that are experienced by people with disabilities. But that's really just the beginning. It's a very, very modest start. We now have to extract people with disabilities from the welfare system. We have to deal with asset limits. We have to deal with clawback. And in the long haul, we have to move to a situation in which people with disabilities are seen as contributing members of society economically and socially as well. So the RDSP may have been a success, but it's really part of a long cadre of changes that will be needed going into the future. So it sets a platform or brings it to one plateau, but we're not at the top of the mountain by any stage of the analysis. Perhaps another more endearing example of this generational nature of change is written up very well, and I commend this book to you, Adam Hochschild's book, Bury the Chains. It's a chronicle of the movement to end slavery, started in the UK in the late 1700s by primarily by a group of Quakers. And the first thing they did was make a strategic decision that they would not end slavery, that they would set as their target and make a decision to end the slave trade. They wanted to cut off, if you will, the supply first and then deal with the other aspects. It took them 20 years, over a generation, to do that just in England. But as we all know, the vestiges of a society which at that time, over 3/4 of the world lived in some form of slavery, the vestiges of that are still being dealt with today. We see it almost daily in the news. We pay attention to what's going on in America. So these are long, hard, tough slogs over many, many years. They're intergenerational, and we have to pay attention to the kind of platforms that we're setting so that we can enable people to be more resilient, more adaptive, better problem solvers as they move forward. I don't know if any of you caught this story, but last year over 200 Japanese pensioners volunteered to begin the cleanup of the Fukushima power plant after the tidal wave off the coast of Japan. And this self-proclaimed skilled veterans corps asserted that they, not younger people, should risk radiation because they are more likely, these pensioners, to die of natural causes before the cancers take hold. This, in my view, is an example of what I think we need to insert into the social innovation agenda, which is what Voland's very, very relevant think tank in the UK calls the future quotient. Bringing it back to Canada, here in Ontario, here to the University of Toronto, Harold Innes, the great Canadian economic historian who was most famous for chronicling the fur trade in our country, said that an obsession with present-mindedness wipes out concerns about the past or the future. So you get my point here, is that if we are overawed by the shiny new engine of social finance, we may forget where we're driving, what that engine is supposed to drive us toward. So I am very sympathetic to the future quotient promoted by Voland's and their redefinition of social innovation to suggest that it must have the capacity to create value in the long term. Put another way, we should be nice to younger generations because they'll be paying for our nursing homes. Marco, can you give me a signal when I'm 5 minutes away, just in case I'm blabbing on too long? Third point I want to make is that social innovation does not have a just dress code. Einstein was a patent clerk. Otherwise, perhaps he would have tried to measure the speed of darkness, not light. Sheila Fraser, Canada's Auditor General, that many of us had lots of criticism about, after 10 years as Canada Auditor General, in her retirement statement said, "I find it really tragic that after 10 years, over 30 audits of First Nations issues on reserve, a fair bit of money, and hard work by public servants, the conditions are worse today than they were 10 years ago when we started auditing." She goes on to say, "We can't keep doing things the same way. Obviously, it's just not working." My point is, she's a profound ally in the social innovation agenda. We may not recognize who our allies are. John Newton is very famous if anybody saw the movie Amazing Grace, has ever heard the hymn, we like to associate him with the abolitionists who were part of the core that ended slavery in the UK. But in fact, he was a brutal slave trader. William Wilberforce, the MP who gets the credit for introducing the legislation to end the slave trade in Britain, in fact, was really a bit player in a marvelous job of community organizing by an unsung community organizer by the name of Thomas Clarkson. And again, I commend this book, Bury the Change, to you if you want to get a better sense of the kind of behind-the-scenes work that went into ending the slave trade. So he toiled behind the scenes, walked every road in England and France, died at the age of 89, still writing pamphlets. The investment manager in Toronto, who manages money over $10 billion for some of the wealthiest Torontonians, had a niece with a disability who knew the person who ran the war room for the Conservative election that got them the win in 2006. He's the man, he's the ally who immediately got us in front of Finance Minister Flaherty within 2 months of their election, which led to him placing his decision to establish a registered disability savings plan in his first budget in May of 2006. Unlikely ally, unlikely social entrepreneur or social innovator, absolutely vital and critical. And I'm not talking yet, and don't forget the public servants whose work wardrobe may be nondescript, but whose passion in some cases has been simmering for 10 years, and they've been minding their P's and Q's, just waiting for you. I like to think of our allies in the social innovation field as like Yehudi Menuhin or even Canada's great fiddler, Don Messer. Do you ever see them? Not like today's fiddlers. They play their music and their face is completely expressionless. Everything is coming out of the instrument. Everything that they want to say is said through their instrument. There are unlikely and untold numbers of social innovation allies out there that don't look and sound like a social innovator. They're not cool, they don't have balding hair and striped shirts like me, but they're out there. And they don't necessarily hang out at events like this. They don't speak our language, but they burn with a passion for justice, just like you and I, and they're waiting for us to arrive and invite them in. Fourth thing I'd like to say about social innovation is that it goes better with belonging. We had more time, I'd take answers to this, but you know, what makes a hand a hand? And people will inevitably say, well, you've got 4 fingers, the relationship between the fingers and the thumb. But in reality, what makes a hand are the spaces in between. And that's a metaphor for relationships and for connections. And as hard as it is to come up with an innovative idea, it's even harder to prove it or to prototype it, and it's that much harder to implement it. So that's hard work, very, very hard work. 3 degrees or stages of hard work in the social innovation spiral. But that's comparatively easy compared to scaling up our innovations so that they get into the water supply, so that they benefit everybody, so that they have long-term structural impact, so they have durability and scale. The hardest task is to implement are the shifts and changes in habits, customs, attitudes, protocols, and relationships associated with the social innovation that we're working. So the laws are the fingers, the funding programs are the fingers, the statutes are the thumb, etc. But the relationships between those are what sustains it and what creates the kind of durable, long-term change that we want. And I can tell you that there are 3 tough challenges to working together. The Advisory Committee, the Advisory Council on Social Entrepreneurship in British Columbia, which was established by the BC government about a year ago that I chair, has come up with an interim report, and our primary recommendation relates to dealing with the issue of how we work together. And I would submit to you that it's very hard to work with allies and colleagues, let alone strangers and opponents. Again, Marco, how much time do I have? Do I have time to diverge for a little story here? I've got 10 minutes. I do have time. So a lot of my work nowadays is in the container called social innovation generation. Tim Broadhead, Francis Wesley, Stephen Huddard, Tim Drayman, Alison Hewitt. These are all people I have immense respect for. Over the years, we became friends. Many of those individuals were there at the beginning of the creation of social innovation generation. So we had friends, we had respect, and we had a common agreement on what we wanted to achieve, more or less, at least in terms of long-term goals. I can tell you that the hardest group of people I have ever worked with in my life were my friends and colleagues who I respected and who I had general agreement on where we were going with. I'll just speak for myself. I pouted during and after meetings. I quit twice. I'm embarrassed by my behavior, and I wasn't the only one. And so we, as we nudged towards some sort of authenticity, as we stumbled toward a new way of being in the world, what we bumped into was this critical, tough challenge of working together in an authentic, realistic way. I can tell you more stories about that, but I just wanted to let you know that these relationships don't come perfectly made and well-run and oiled. Imagine then working with strangers whose motivations from business, from government, or what government thinks about us. Just imagine, you know, the additional challenges of working together that apply when we're working with people that we've not met before and that we easily typecast, let alone those who have been our opponents. And I would submit to you that the big challenge that we have, if we're serious about justice, and if we're serious about moving the counter, if we're serious about structural reform, we have to learn to work together with our friends and our allies and strangers, and most importantly, with our opponents. When a new leader is elected nationally, provincially, municipally, I always fall a little bit in love with them. I want to experience them as a friend would. I want to find parts of me that are in them, and I want to discover parts of them that are in me. I want a relationship with them regardless of our differences. Now, I'm not talking about friendship. That may evolve out of that, but I am talking about civility. I'm talking about ending the role that our sector seems to play in which it thinks that it has to act like the opposition party in Parliament, where we deride, where we decry, whether we ignore our common humanity. And I would suggest to you that unless we deal with that tough challenge, we will continue to be in this combative environment in this country. The noble art, there's a Danish scientist by the name of Piet Hein. He has a beautiful poem. The noble art of losing face will one day save the human race and turn into eternal merit what other people call disgrace. I think the call in our sector is to be peacemakers, is to end the war, is to move towards solutions with respect. And let's face it, a dysfunctional family is one that has more than one person in it. So does a coalition, a system, a society, a network. We have to get along, I believe, even when we don't like, trust, and don't know others. Our calling is the call to heal. And the last point I'd like to make is that social innovation has negative side effects. George Bernard Shaw wrote the following. Hegel was right when he said that we learn from history that humans can never learn anything from history. And what we know this in every aspect of our life, that there are unintended consequences to everything we do, including social innovation. Every new social innovation technique, method, law, or financing should be judged in terms of in the context of whether it's advancing social, economic, or environmental justice. It can be used for good or for ill. In social innovation that's used in the context of making group home living more efficient for people with disabilities, is reinforcing the status quo that holds people with disabilities captive of a service provider system and maintains their role as a client and reduces the possibility of them becoming a contributing citizen. So innovation that simply reinforces the status quo, which it can be useful, in that case I would suggest is being used for ill. I was in Brussels last year for the launch of Social Innovation Europe. And one of the gentlemen whose name I gave as a reference in the 5 references on your sheet, Ezio Mancini, was in a session with me, and a gentleman was up front who had invented a collapsible smart car. And so this was going to kind of make it easy for getting around the streets, producing less fuel emissions, and more importantly, saving all kinds of square footage for parking. So obviously a good thing to do. And so he wanted us in this workshop to give him advice about how to introduce this into European cities. Ezio Mancini stands up and very civil, says, I'm happy to go along with this exercise. I realize what it is on the one hand, but on the other hand, let me remind us that over the last 40 years, cars have steadily been getting more and more and more fuel efficient. But the totality of all the fuel-efficient cars out there has produced more of a carbon footprint than ever before. And so simply making more cars that allow people to drive them, that continue to pollute the environment, may be a use of social innovation that actually has an unintended consequence. His argument was, why don't we shift the game and start talking about making our cities habitable for bikes, for walking, and the like. So anyway, 2 simple stories related to that. This is a Canadian specialty, understanding the iatrogenic effects of, or the unintended consequences of interventions. I mentioned Harold Innes at the beginning, who wrote the history of the fur trade. His central thesis was that there was an irony related to the growth of the fur trade in Canada, that in the process of getting rich, the Europeans who exploited our resources destroyed the very culture and way of life, that is, First Nations people, that made their wealth possible. Harold Innes was a great influencer on Marshall McLuhan. You think of George Grant, you think of Naomi Klein, you think of Ursula Franklin, you think of Margaret Atwood, you think of Mark Kingwell. All Canadians, all Ontarians who specialize in analyzing the unintended consequences of our actions and who help us to appreciate that no technology, whether it's a cell phone technology or a social technology, is is neutral. It can be used for good or for ill. The fur trade, in that regard then, in Innes's context, can be seen as a metaphor for all new social innovation techniques, technologies, interventions, practices, methodologies, knowledge and communication distribution system. So, as present-day explorers, let's not repeat the mistakes of the early fur traders. I know thousands of coureurs de bois and passionate amateurs out there who are just waiting to come out of the cold and join you and join us. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.